Welcome to Aston Means Business, a podcast from Aston Business School. My name's Steve Dyson, and I'm a journalist who's interviewing some of the top business academics across the UK here at Aston. This podcast has been going since October 2019, and there are now more than 40 previous episodes that you can find and listen to simply by Googling Aston Means Business. Today's episode is entitled Strikes: Is Britain Facing a Winter of Discontent? We're going to explore this subject with Professor Kathy Daniels. She's an expert in employment law and employee relations, and she's also an Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor in Engagement here at Aston University. Hello, Kathy.
Hello, Steve.
Kathy, thanks for joining us again on Aston Means Business. For listeners who've not come across you before, quickly remind us who you are, what you were doing before you arrived at Aston, and what your focus is now in your role at Aston.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I'm a professor of practice, and as you say, I'm Associate Pro-Vice Chancellor Engagement. So Professor of Practice is really recognising my background, which is as a practitioner. So I started off my career working in human resources. I was head of human resources at a large manufacturing business here in the West Midlands. And when I had my first child, an awful long time ago now, I left that and I set up my own consultancy, writing, consulting, and talking about employment law, which is what I just find fascinating. And my approach is very much about the practical implication of employment law and employee relations for those working in organisations. And so it's all about being very practical, hence Professor of Practice. And that is also what I do at Aston. So I'm involved, if you like, on the business side of the university. So the very many things that a university needs to do to operate effectively, which is a very fascinating line of work.
I'm sure it is. Now today, Kathy, we're looking at the subject of industrial action. It's a very topical subject, of course, given the unrest of workers across various sectors in the UK as we speak at the moment. Everyone in the UK, I'm sure, has experienced the impact of the recent rail and postal strikes, and there's now action or potential action ahead of us from potentially teachers, nurses, firefighters, to name just a few disputes which are bubbling away. In short, we seem to have millions of public sector workers and some in the private sector preparing to vote on strikes or voting already to strike in what's been described as the biggest potential wave of industrial action since the 1970s. Kathy, why is this happening?
Okay, so I think it's a little bit of a perfect storm of things coming together. First of all, we've had COVID, and for a couple of years really, employees on the whole have not taken industrial action. Of course, a lot were furloughed. But also, if you had employment during the pandemic, given the number of people that weren't able to work, there seemed to be very much an attitude of, well, keep your head down and be thankful that you've got work. And so some of the sort of general bubbling along of discontent that we usually have wasn't happening, and that seems to have all piled up. And then, of course, we have the very real issue of the cost of living crisis. And people are worried about being able to pay their bills. The cost of energy, of course, has gone up hugely. And so a lot of the industrial action that you've just mentioned is around pay. I'll just come back to that point in a moment. And so you've got that bubbling along. And also, inflation has been very low for many years. And so employers have been saying to their employees, you only need a pay increase at the level of inflation to keep you at the same standard of living. So that's all we're giving you. And now, of course, inflation has gone up hugely, and employers are saying, well, we're not paying you a pay increase that equals inflation. But if you've been saying that we need a increase that is equal to inflation when it's low, why are you changing your mind when it's high? And so you've got those sort of three things coming together. But if I could just come back to the point about pay, that's the headline news all the time, that there's disputes about pay. What you typically find is that when you drill down and you really explore what's going on, it may be that pay is the headline reason, but quite often when something bubbles up to the point of being industrial action, there's lots of discontent for lots of different reasons, and it all sort of comes together. And so we shouldn't be misled by just labeling as everything is about pay. And I think that brings us back to the COVID point, that there may have been things that employees were unhappy about over the last couple of years, but keep your head down, you've got a job, just be grateful. And now those things are bubbling up. So quite a mix of things going on, really.
That's really interesting to hear it's laid out like that. Now, in terms of industrial action, Kathy, can anyone strike? I mean, what's the legal standing of such disputes? Is there actually a right to strike?
Well, that is a very interesting legal question. First of all, there are some groups who are not allowed to strike legally. So the armed forces, the police, prison officers, they are not legally allowed to take industrial action. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that taking strike action or calling strike action is a breach of contract. So your contract of employment says that you will work. And if you are rotated to work and you don't, and it's not because you're ill or you're on holiday, but you're just refusing to go to work, then you are in breach of contract. And if you're in breach of contract, then your contract can be terminated. Also, if you are inducing others to breach a contract, which arguably you're doing by encouraging them to take strike action, that is also a tort, a wrong in law. So that suggests, therefore, that legally you can't take strike action, but you can, because there is something that we refer to as the golden formula that is allowed for in law, which says that if you walk away from your work, so you take strike action in furtherance of a trade dispute, then it is lawful. And that is how this difficulty of it potentially being breach of contract is addressed in law, that the golden formula says if the reason that you are striking, you're walking away from work, is in furtherance of a trade dispute, then it is potentially lawful. I say potentially because we've got to have a fair ballot process first.
It's fascinating stuff, the legal surroundings of strike action and industrial action. I think I mentioned the 1970s before. It's often described in the UK as a decade of strikes and industrial unrest, with the so-called Winter of Discontent entering history books. Now, those disputes rumbled on into the 1980s, and they ended up with the renowned miners' strike and their flying pickets that saw thousands of strikers clashing with mounted police at one stage. Now, while we are facing industrial unrest today, the law was a lot different back then, wasn't it?
It was definitely different, and it was easier to take industrial action because the rigour that we have now, particularly around the ballot process, wasn't there. You refer to the miners' strike, 1984-85, and that was quite a turning point for employee relations in the UK. And the Prime Minister at the time, of course, was Margaret Thatcher. And Margaret Thatcher quite openly talked of the need to reduce the power of the trade unions and, in effect, therefore, reduce the power of the employees, because we were in a very heavily unionised period of time. And many commentators refer to it as a pair of scales, and that the balance of power was all with the employees. We could argue that point, but definitely what Margaret Thatcher was doing by taking on the miners. And the interesting point about that strike was that there had been a number of strikes by the miners leading up to that point. And each time the government had caved in. And what Margaret Thatcher did, unknown to the miners, was stockpile a year's worth of coal. And therefore, when the miners walked out, she knew that she could keep coal moving around the UK because there was a year's worth of coal stockpiled. And so she didn't just face the miners and sort of dig her heels in. She planned to really force that change in the balance of power. So that obviously was a non-legal point, but then the law altered as well. And that the most recent significant change of law, and I say significant, and I'll come back to that in a moment, was the Trade Union Act 2016. And what that did, just one small thing that it did, was change rules about balloting, so that prior to 2016, let's say you had 100 people in the organisation, you ballot for industrial action, let's say only 3 vote, and 2 of them are in favour, a majority is in favour. And therefore, that's a mandate to take industrial action. That's quite ridiculous that 100 people can be called out on the basis of 3 people voting and 2 being in favour. And so the Trade Union Act 2016 said that if we ballot a group of people for industrial action, at least 50% of those who are eligible to vote must vote. And that, again, has eroded the ability to take industrial action. There's quite a lot of instances of industrial action that would not have happened had those rules been in place at the time. Coming back to my point about significant, there has been a very recent change in the law, and that is to allow employers to use agency workers to cover work that would have been carried out by people who were on strike. And that alteration was made this year. And that, again, is just eroding that impact of industrial action. So it's not that we saw a big change, a sort of U-turn in the legislation. It's sort of been chipped away bit by bit, really since the mid 1980s.
Now, just to get my head completely clear on this legal point, is this increased difficulty of striking or taking other forms of industrial action made easier if workers belong to a trade union?
Okay, so only trade unions can call industrial action. So it's not so much that it's about being easier. This is something that trade unions do. Now, it has to be a recognised trade union. So what I mean by that is you can go and work in an organisation where there is no relationship between a trade union and the employer. You can still join a trade union. There are some restrictions on certain trade unions that you have to be in certain professions to join certain trade unions. But as long as you're eligible, you can join a trade union. But your employer doesn't have to talk to that trade union just because you've joined it. A recognition agreement means that the trade union and the employer have agreed to engage in collective bargaining. And so they have a relationship. And they will have specified whether that relationship covers the whole organisation or specific groups within that organisation. And if you work in the bit of the organisation that is covered by that recognition agreement, then you are covered by the relationship between the employer and the trade union. And then if they fall out and the trade union calls industrial action, you will be able to take part in that. And interestingly, you don't have to be a member of the trade union to take strike action. If you are covered by a recognition agreement, but you personally haven't joined that trade union, it doesn't mean that you can't join in with the strike.
Now, a lot of what we've discussed is around actual strike action. But this is just the extreme end of what workers can do if they are in dispute with bosses, isn't it? I mean, if workers are unhappy and feel they have a justifiable cause, what else can they legally do? What are the steps that they can take before it is an all-out strike?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's supposed to be on a ballot paper for industrial action is to make it very clear that whether this is balloting for industrial action or industrial action including a strike, you've got to have that option of saying, yeah, I'll go on strike, or yeah, I'll take action, but not a strike. So other things that we see are things like overtime bans. And of course, that's only effective in organisations that rely heavily on overtime, or work to rule as well. A lot of us do extra things, and that might just be that we're contracted to work 9 to 5, but we're always at our desk at 8, for example. Or it may be extra duties that we just do out of the kindness of our heart almost. And so a work to rule says, I'll do what's in my contract, I'll do what's in my job description, I won't do anything else. But again, we're still into formal action here. If we sort of go down the line, what you typically see is that when employees are dissatisfied, there's more subtle demonstrations of this. And it can just be the demotivation, the apathy, not doing a very good job. Quite often you see an increase in sickness absence, not particularly because it's making people sick, but we've all had those days when you've really felt quite poorly, but you've dragged yourself to work. Well, you don't if you're demotivated. And increased employee turnover, people just leave. And at the moment, within HR circles, there's a lot of talk of the great resignation, and that lots of surveys are showing that there's a significant number of employees who are planning to leave. So, and then, of course, you can also raise a formal grievance and formally say to your employer that you're upset about something. So lots of things you can do, actually.
Now, I want to see if we can give listeners a bit of legal advice, Kathy, if that's okay with you. Informal legal advice, of course. First of all, let's consider the workers. So if staff are unhappy at work, what would your primary advice be for what they can legally do? I mean, what are the first steps they should take before they even consider strike action?
My first advice would be, don't think about the law. So there is a formal grievance process, and the ACAS Code of Practice, Disciplinary and Grievance Procedures, says that any employee can put a grievance in writing to their employer. Their employer then has to formally hold a grievance meeting, and if the employee doesn't like the outcome, they can appeal against that. And then if the employee is still dissatisfied and it is a legal matter, then potentially there's a claim to the Employment Tribunal. But I remember my first ever boss in HR, and that's going back some time. I remember him saying to me, always try to encourage employees to keep things out of the formal grievance process. Because once you get into that formality, there is a process and a momentum that gathers. Whereas actually the best thing to do if you're dissatisfied is to have a chat and to tell your employer. And quite often, line managers haven't realised. And so forget about the law. Don't think about it as a legal confrontation. Start off by just dealing with the matter informally and trying to solve it. But ultimately, if you can't do it that way and the formal grievance route doesn't work, then the question is whether the matter is one of a legal dispute, in which case you've got the tribunal route. Or if it's just that you're unhappy, the main answer is to go elsewhere.
What about business leaders out there, Kathy? Whether they be senior management in a large firm or the actual owner of a small or medium-sized enterprise, if they are facing disputes and potential industrial action, what can they do or what should they be doing?
Yeah, well, the first thing is to try and have positive relationships. A lot of the sectors where we see a lot of industrial action regularly have industrial action. So you mentioned the train strikes at the start of this conversation, and there have been loads of industrial action over the years involving the train drivers and others working in the rail industry. There are some fundamental problems with the employment relationships there, it seems, that whenever things get difficult, it turns to conflict. So when you're actually in a conflict time, you've just got to manage it. And if it has turned into something formal, there are processes that you've got to follow. But really, the main advice to business leaders is work on those relationships and don't be afraid to confront problems, because when problems fester, then they eventually become a bigger issue, and it's then become more difficult to solve. So, talking to your employees, having employee representation bodies, whether you've got trade unions or not, having that formal communication, carrying out employee surveys, asking employees what it is they're concerned about, and addressing those issues. That's what business leaders should be doing.
Finally, Kathy, what do you say when you hear the media talking about Britain facing the worst industrial unrest since the 1970s? In short, are we really heading towards another winter of discontent?
Oh, well, that's a really difficult question to answer, isn't it? Because there is a possibility that we are going towards a period of quite significant industrial action, because we're seeing that already. We're seeing quite sizable groups of employees taking industrial action and it going on. The winter of discontent involved a lot of different areas of work coming together and taking industrial action in a more coordinated way. Are we likely to see that? I'm not convinced, because I don't think we have that strength of feeling across enough areas. But having said that, if we go back to the start of the conversation, the issue around the cost of living, the issue around inflation, they are common issues across so many people. And I think if employers don't actually address some of those issues, we might not see the winter of discontent on the scale of the 1970s, but I think we are going to see more industrial action than we currently are doing.
Professor Kathy Daniels, an expert in employment law and employee relations and an associate pro-vice-chancellor in engagement here at Aston University. Thanks so much for taking part in this episode of Aston Means Business.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, our audience, for listening to Aston Means Business, an original podcast series for Aston University. Remember, if you enjoyed today's episode, you can find and listen to earlier episodes by simply Googling Aston Means Business. And if you're interested in studying anything to do with business, finance or economics, why not check out what Aston Business School has to offer at www.aston.ac.uk/courses. We've also got a podcast series called Society Matters. That interviews top academics at the Aston School of Social Sciences and Humanities about current issues and concepts which shape our world and the way that people live. You can find those episodes simply by Googling Society Matters Aston. Meanwhile, we'll be back soon with more interviews with some of the UK's top business academics here at Aston. Aston Means Business. Thanks for listening.